You made it, just in time. Go ahead and turn the lights down low if you haven't already. Let the hum of the fan or the whir of soft noise around you settle into the edges of your mind. You don't need to do anything right now. No problems to solve, no forms to fill, no thinking about what's next. Just breathe. This is your moment to let go. If you enjoy these long, quiet stories, the kind that let you drift without needing to stay awake to the end, go ahead and like the video. It really helps more people find it. And if you want to, leave a comment telling me what time it is where you are. I love seeing all the little lights across the globe, all of us falling asleep together in our own corners of the night. This evening's story is about the fall of the Roman Empire, but not the loud version, the one with fire and screaming and barbarians on horseback crashing through marble gates. No, we're not doing that one. Tonight, we're going to walk through something slower, something sadder, and maybe something a little more familiar. Rome didn't really fall, not like that. It withered, it cracked, it sank under its own weight like a great ship built to cross the world, taking on water one slow leak at a time. That's the story we'll be telling tonight. It starts with coins and roads and ends with silence and memory. You'll hear about emperors you've never learned about, towns no one ruled, children born into an empire already mostly ghost. There's no twist to stay awake for and no pressure to reach the ending. It's okay if you don't. The story will still be here, moving gently beneath your dreams, so close your eyes. Let the sound of my voice blur at the edges. You don't need to follow every word. You're allowed to fade. That's part of the journey. And now, if you're ready, let's begin the long, quiet story of how the Roman Empire didn't fall, but slowly, softly, faded away. We like things to happen all at once. It's how we tell stories. A hero rises, a villain is defeated, a kingdom falls, clean, clear, contained. But the fall of the Roman Empire didn't obey those rules. There was no singular event, no final battle, no day when the city of Rome went dark and the world officially changed. It's tempting to imagine it that way. We picture Roman legions breaking under the charge of wild barbarian horsemen. We imagine flames licking the columns of the Forum while senators shout and statues fall. But the truth is quieter, stranger, more drawn out. It's not that Rome fell, it's that it stopped working. Not on a Tuesday or even in a single year, but gradually. First in corners, then at the edges, then in places people tried not to notice. And the whole time, no one really agreed on when or if it had happened. The year 476 is often pointed to as the official moment. That's when a boy named Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor in the West, was deposed by a man named Odoacer, a Germanic general. Romulus wasn't executed. He wasn't dragged through the streets. He was quietly sent away to live in comfort on a villa. There was no public execution, no declaration of an ending, just a boy taken off the throne, a few ceremonial objects sent east to Constantinople, the end of the line, not with a crash, but with a shrug. But if you lived in Rome, or in one of its many distant provinces, you wouldn't have pointed to that year as the end. You would have felt it long before, or long after, or not at all. For some, the empire had already fallen 100 years earlier, when the currency began to fail and plagues emptied the streets. For others, it would continue in their minds for generations, long after the emperors were gone. That's what makes the fall so strange. It wasn't really a fall, it was a drift, a long, aching sigh stretched over centuries. There were high points and low points, brief moments of hope, followed by new disappointments. The people didn't panic, they adapted. They married off daughters to barbarian kings. They traded grain for safety. They repurposed old Roman buildings into churches, or barns, or nothing at all. The marble stayed, but the meaning leaked out, and in the stories people told afterward, they tried to give the fall a shape. Some blamed luxury, others blamed foreign enemies. Some said Rome had become too soft, others said it had become too cruel. But most of these explanations came long after the fact, like trying to explain a dream that slowly unraveled before you even realized you were sleeping. It's worth remembering that Rome didn't die everywhere. Even after 476, the Eastern Roman Empire, what we call the Byzantine Empire, continued for nearly 1,000 years. It had emperors, armies, palaces, and politics. It survived invasions, revolts, religious upheavals, and when it finally did fall, in 1453, it still called itself Roman, still thought of itself as part of the same story. So maybe the empire didn't fall at all. Maybe it just changed shape, like a river taking on new paths, while the old ones dry up behind it. But we need an ending. Our brains crave it. So we draw a line. We say, this is where the ancient world stopped and the medieval one began. But lines like that don't exist in real life. People don't wake up one morning and realize they've entered a new age. They just keep living, planting, praying, arguing, loving, dying. So the myth of Rome's sudden collapse, it's just that, a myth, a story told afterward to make sense of something too big to hold all at once. What really happened was longer, sadder, and in many ways more human. It started with silver, or rather, the slow, quiet disappearance of it. At the height of the Roman Empire, silver coins were the bedrock of the economy. They were heavy in the hand, cleanly struck, and reliable. A denarius could be trusted. You could feel its weight, hear its ring, and know what it meant. Merchants accepted it, soldiers demanded it. It passed through countless hands, from generals to farmers, from nobles to butchers, and kept its meaning the whole way through. But over time, the silver became less pure. A little copper here, a bit more the next year, and still more after that. The coins looked similar at first, though duller, but they felt different. They bent more easily. The ring they made when dropped was less musical, more muted. Traders began to notice. People became cautious. Prices crept upward. This wasn't a sudden event. It happened over decades. Each new emperor inherited not only the burdens of rule, but the need to fund a vast empire, one that was increasingly stretched thin. There were wars to pay for, forts to maintain, roads to build, and when there wasn't enough silver to go around, the solution seemed simple: dilute what was left. At first it worked. The mints kept churning, the troops were paid, but trust is a fragile thing, and soon merchants began charging more for the same goods, knowing the coins they were receiving were worth less than they used to be. Inflation took root, slowly then quickly. Imagine living in that world. 1 year your loaf of bread costs 2 coins, the next it's 4, then 8. You're not earning more, you're just holding more coins that mean less. Your savings melt without burning, your wages lag behind. You begin to trade for goods instead, grain for cloth, tools for meat. Barter returns, not because people want it, but because it works when coins do not. People hoard old coins, the heavy ones, the real ones. They bury them in fields, stash them under loose stones, sew them into clothing, a hidden savings account, safer than any treasury. The government tries to respond. Edicts are issued. One of the most famous came from Emperor Diocletian in the year 301 AD. The Edict on Maximum Prices. It was a long, detailed document that tried to fix the cost of everything, from a loaf of bread to a teacher's salary. The punishments for violating it were harsh, but markets are stubborn. Prices didn't stay fixed. Traders refused to sell at a loss. Goods disappeared from the stalls, and soon the edict itself faded away. Alongside this economic unraveling, the tax system began to buckle. Taxes were collected in coin, but if coins were unreliable, what then? So the empire began to collect taxes in kind. Wheat, livestock, olive oil. A soldier might be paid in hides. A road crew might be rewarded with barrels of wine. It worked, more or less, but it was clumsy. Transporting goods was harder than counting coins. Storing them risked spoilage. Corruption grew like mold. Tax collectors became feared. They no longer arrived with ledgers, but with troops. They'd assess not just what you owed, but what you might owe. Land was overvalued, inventories exaggerated. Peasants who couldn't pay fled into the woods, or bound themselves to landowners who could protect them. Freedom was traded for stability. Slowly, the class of small independent farmers, the backbone of the old republic, began to vanish. Wealth concentrated. A few landowners became very powerful. Their estates grew into near kingdoms. Within their walls, they minted their own rules. They fed their workers, housed them, protected them. In exchange, those workers stayed forever. This was the early shape of feudalism, long before the word existed. Cities suffered too. Without reliable currency, trade declined. Without trade, shops closed. Without shops, cities lost purpose. Some cities shrank, others emptied entirely. A few were abandoned, the stones taken to build walls or mend barns. But Rome itself, at least for a while, endured. It was still the center, still full of statues and echoes. Senators still wore togas, the Senate still convened, the emperors still issued coins, now smaller, rougher, lighter, but fewer and fewer people believed in their value. There's a quiet tragedy to a coin that no longer means what it once did, because money isn't just metal, it's belief, a shared trust. And when that trust erodes, the metal becomes just that, metal. The collapse of currency didn't make headlines. It wasn't dramatic, but it chipped away at the empire's foundations. People lost faith in the state's ability to support them. Soldiers doubted their pay. Farmers distrusted markets. And the merchants, who once crossed continents on Roman roads, began to stay closer to home. Rome was still called an empire, but fewer people felt it in their hands. When people think of the fall of Rome, they rarely think of the rain, or the lack of it, or the timing of the harvests, or how a wet spring could rot the grain before it ever reached the oven. But empires are made of bread and water as much as they're made of armies and gold. And by the time the empire was beginning to thin at the edges, its stomach was already aching. In good years, Roman agriculture was a marvel of efficiency. There were systems, networks of farms, granaries, warehouses, transport ships that carried wheat from Egypt to feed mouths in Rome. When the system worked, it was smooth, almost invisible, but it only worked when every piece did its job. The farmers planted on time, the weather cooperated, the taxmen didn't take too much, the roads were safe, the ships were quick, and the grain reached the city before it spoiled. When any one of those pieces failed, when locusts came early, or the river ran low, or a levee demanded too much too soon, the whole chain suffered, and when too many of those pieces broke in a row, people starved. As the empire weakened, the safety nets grew thinner. Some were cut deliberately to save cost, others just fell apart. The granaries emptied, the ports got quieter. Trade routes that once felt like arteries slowly became dead ends. In some regions, especially in the far reaches of Gaul or Britain, the system stopped altogether. A bad season didn't just mean hunger, it meant abandonment. People would pack up, leave, and move toward whatever land could still feed them. Or they would stay and shrink. Stomachs tightened, children grew slower, elderly relatives disappeared more quietly than before. Hunger changed behavior. Cities that once hosted bustling markets and laughing fountains began to feel quieter, more suspicious. Grain became a guarded possession. Rumors traveled fast. This town has bread, that one doesn't. Someone's hoarding sacks in the cellar. Sometimes the rumors were true. Other times they led to theft, or worse. Famine doesn't always shout. It creeps. It makes people watch their neighbors more closely. It makes mothers go silent during dinner. It makes soldiers demand payment in food instead of coin. And just when it seemed the stomach couldn't bear more, sickness arrived. Rome had known disease before. It was a companion to growth. Where people gathered, where armies marched, where ships sailed, the disease followed. But during the empire's later centuries, it returned with new teeth. The Antonine Plague was one of the first great waves, possibly smallpox or measles, spreading like wildfire among troops returning from the east. It devastated towns, hollowed out villages, and killed emperors. The plague of Cyprian came later, during the 3rd century. Another brutal illness, described by those who witnessed it as constant vomiting, ulcers in the throat, and unrelenting fever. Whatever it was, it lingered. Some cities reported thousands of deaths a day. Entire regions felt emptied. And then there were the smaller, unnamed plagues, the ones that didn't leave dramatic chronicles or famous speeches. They just left empty cradles and silent homes. A family's youngest child wouldn't wake up. The neighbors wouldn't visit. People would start burning things in the street, not out of ritual, but out of desperation, to clean the air, to scare the illness off. The connection between famine and plague wasn't understood in the way we understand it now, but people noticed the pattern. Hunger weakened the body, illness followed close behind, and as both became more frequent, the population began to shrink, not in dramatic one-time disasters, but steadily year after year, decade after decade. Cemeteries expanded, work stopped in places, entire trades vanished. Priests said it was punishment. Some said it was the gods. Others said it was the Christian God. Whichever they followed, the message was the same: repent, change, obey. Maybe things would get better, but often they didn't. Governments tried to respond in the only ways they knew. They reissued grain laws, they declared prayers, they blamed enemies or heretics, they raised taxes to rebuild what had crumbled, but a dead tax base doesn't pay. A dying town doesn't export food. An empire on its knees can't stand tall when sickness comes knocking. And still, people endured. They didn't vanish. They learned to make do with less. They foraged more, planted new crops, boiled herbs, shared rumors of which villages still had clean wells. Midwives began carrying charms and cures. Priests held services in the open air, hoping that the wind would carry away what the body could not. The old bathhouses, once symbols of health and pleasure, became places of fear. People stopped gathering in them. The water stood stagnant, the tiles cracked, mosaics grew slippery with moss. Some were shuttered entirely, others were used as makeshift hospitals, then as tombs, and all the while the empire still claimed to be whole. Maps still bore the eagle, edicts still carried the emperor's seal. But what is an empire if it cannot feed its people? What is power when your soldiers are too weak to march and your farmers are too hungry to plant? Some towns disappeared entirely, not with fire or swords, but by degrees. First the traders stopped coming, then the priest moved on, then the last family left. What remained were ruins and stories, stone walls half swallowed by vines, foundations that shifted in the earth, names remembered only in fading ink. The Roman Empire was not destroyed by one disease or one famine, but it was slowly, repeatedly hollowed out by them. And over time, the sound of empire became quieter, not because it had ended, but because fewer people were left to speak it aloud. When people imagine the fall of Rome, they often picture the moment the gates burst open. Strange warriors in animal skins pouring through marble archways, shouting in foreign tongues, swinging axes into statues, and lighting fires beneath the dome of heaven. But the truth, as always, is quieter. The barbarians didn't simply arrive. Many of them had been there for years, and some had no interest in destroying Rome. They wanted to be part of it. The word barbarian itself came from the Roman tongue. To them, it described anyone who didn't speak Latin or Greek. It was a word of sound before meaning, those who spoke barbar, gibberish to Roman ears. But this lumped together dozens of different peoples with different customs, different languages, different hopes. The Goths, the Vandals, the Franks, the Alemanni, the Huns. Some were nomads, some were farmers, some were Christians, others pagan. They were not one invading horde, but a tide of pressures and migrations that ebbed and flowed along the empire's borders. For decades, Rome had made deals with these groups. Agreements were struck. Tribes could settle within imperial lands in exchange for soldiers, loyalty, taxes. Some were granted farmland, others were hired as auxiliaries, support troops in the Roman army. Some rose high in the ranks, commanding Roman legions themselves. Their children learned Latin. Their sons became Roman citizens. They worshipped in Roman churches. They wore Roman armor. But integration is not the same as equality. Even those barbarians who served Rome found themselves distrusted, kept at arm's length, used but not embraced, and the Roman state, stretched thin and increasingly desperate, often failed to uphold its side of the bargain. Promised land wasn't always delivered. Payments came late or not at all. Roman officials exploited these newcomers, overtaxed them, insulted their leaders. They were treated as tools, useful until broken. In 376 AD, one of these groups, the Visigoths, sought refuge from an even greater terror. The Huns, horse-riding warriors from the east, had begun to drive Germanic tribes westward. The Visigoths, pressed against the Danube frontier, begged for sanctuary within the empire. The Roman emperor agreed. They could settle, provided they disarmed and accepted Roman oversight. But what happened next was not hospitality. Corruption festered. Roman officials extorted the refugees, selling them spoiled food at exorbitant prices. Some children were taken as hostages. Hunger turned to anger. That anger became rebellion. In 378, the Visigoths rose up. At the Battle of Adrianople, they met the Roman army in full force. The Emperor Valens chose to engage them without waiting for reinforcements. It was a disaster. Roman formations were outmaneuvered. Their lines collapsed. The cavalry fled. Valens himself died on the field, burned alive in a farmhouse, according to some accounts. It was one of the worst defeats in Roman history. The shock was immense. An emperor dead in battle, an entire Roman army shattered, and the Visigoths were still inside the empire, still looking for a place to call home. Rome couldn't expel them. It had to live with them, and so more compromises were made. The empire continued to absorb these tribes, formally or informally. The lines between Roman and barbarian blurred. Generals bore Gothic names. Emperors married the daughters of tribal chieftains. Some barbarian leaders adopted Roman titles, called themselves consuls, and governed lands once administered from Rome itself. But tension never vanished. There was no melting pot, only friction. The Roman elite still looked down on these people. They were seen as uncultured, unpredictable, dangerous, and yet they were needed. The empire could no longer defend its vast borders alone. It needed Gothic spears, Vandal horses, Frankish scouts. It needed the same men it feared. This uneasy coexistence continued for decades. Some tribes carved out semi-independent regions, still claiming loyalty to the emperor. Others openly challenged Roman authority. And the great irony is that many of these so-called barbarians didn't want to destroy Rome. They admired it. They wanted its titles, its wealth, its glory. When they fought to be acknowledged, to be seen, to be respected. When that was denied, they took what they could. In the end, the gates did open, but not to an unknown enemy. They opened to former allies, to soldiers who had marched beneath Roman banners, to leaders who had once sworn oaths in Latin. The fear of barbarians at the gate makes for dramatic storytelling, but the more sobering truth is that the gate had already been opened from the inside, not just by force, but by policy, by desperation, by slow compromise after slow compromise. The empire let them in, then failed to make them feel at home, and by the time they demanded more, Rome had little left to give. It wasn't betrayal, it was survival for both sides. And that, perhaps, is the strangest part of all. The end didn't come from an alien force crashing into a proud and united Rome. It came from inside, from people who had already eaten Roman bread, worn Roman armor, and prayed in Roman churches. People who had been part of the empire for years. But when the center grew too weak to hold them, they stopped pretending. The empire had always prided itself on control. Rome was the master of its own fate, builder of roads, forger of laws, commander of legions. Its enemies were distant, often faceless, easily contained within maps and borders. But in the summer of 378 AD, at a place called Adrianople, that illusion of invincibility was shattered, not by an overwhelming horde or a betrayal from within, but by a series of misjudgments, misunderstandings, and one fatal decision by a man who thought he had more time than he did. By that year, the Visigoths had been inside the empire for 2 years. They had been allowed in under pressure, fleeing the Huns and seeking asylum. The Roman state had granted them permission to settle south of the Danube, but the agreement had been broken almost immediately. Corrupt officials, desperate for wealth and control, exploited the Gothic refugees. They demanded bribes for food, withheld supplies, and even took Gothic children as hostages. Rather than being welcomed as allies or partners, the Visigoths were starved, humiliated, and finally provoked into rebellion. As tensions grew and skirmishes flared, the Emperor Valens, ruling the eastern half of the empire from Constantinople, saw an opportunity. He believed he could put down the uprising quickly and decisively, scoring a personal victory without waiting for reinforcements from the Western Emperor Gratian. But Valens underestimated the size and resolve of the Gothic force. He also underestimated the deep resentment that had grown among them. What began as a minor revolt was fast becoming a full-scale war. The two armies met near the city of Adrianople in what is now modern-day Edirne in Turkey. The Roman army was large, but tired and ill-prepared. They marched under the summer sun with little rest and poor coordination. Their scouts gave conflicting reports. The terrain favored the Goths, who had set up their camp behind a wagon fort, a circle of wagons arranged for defense, protecting not just warriors, but their families and supplies. Valens believed the main Gothic force was not present. He assumed they were disorganized and vulnerable, so he ordered the attack. The decision proved catastrophic. As Roman troops advanced, they were met not by a weak defensive position, but by a coordinated and determined resistance. And worse, the main Gothic cavalry, which had been out raiding, returned to the battlefield at precisely the wrong or right moment. They didn't just flank the Roman army, they enveloped it. Chaos followed. The Roman lines collapsed under pressure, units scattered. Some were crushed against the Gothic wagon circle, others fled into the open fields and were cut down. Communications broke apart. Officers died trying to rally their men. The Roman cavalry was outmatched. Even the elite units, veterans of previous campaigns, could not hold, and somewhere in the melee, Valens himself was wounded. Accounts vary, but most agree he was carried into a nearby farmhouse, where he hoped to recover or hide. The building was discovered by Gothic warriors and set ablaze. Valens died not on the battlefield, sword in hand, but inside a burning farmhouse, unnamed and unburied. The loss was staggering. Estimates suggest that 2/3 of the Roman army were killed or wounded. It was one of the worst defeats in the history of the empire, comparable only to ancient disasters like Cannae or Carrhae. But this one felt different. It was not inflicted by an eastern kingdom or a desert revolt. It was carried out by people who had asked for shelter and who had been mistreated into rebellion. The psychological blow to the empire was immense. For centuries, Roman armies had stood as the wall between civilization and chaos. Even in defeat, they were expected to hold the line. Adrianople proved they could be broken and that the state could fail to protect its own. It also marked a shift in military structure. After the battle, it became clear that Rome could no longer rely entirely on its own citizens or traditional forces. More and more, it turned to federated troops, barbarian allies settled within the empire who would serve in exchange for land or payments. This shift had already begun, but Adrianople accelerated it. The army became more fragmented, less disciplined, and increasingly dependent on the very people it once viewed as threats. In the aftermath, the Visigoths did not march on Constantinople. Perhaps they lacked the strength or will. Instead, they roamed the countryside, looting and burning, until the empire made new concessions. Eventually, they were settled in the Balkans, with a degree of autonomy that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. But something deeper had changed. The myth of Roman supremacy had cracked. The emperor was dead. The legions were bloodied. The enemy was no longer at the border, but within it, and they had won. People felt the shift, even if they couldn't name it. Fear spread. Rumors twisted the truth into legend. Some said Valens had been betrayed. Others claimed he was cursed. The empire carried on, as it always did, patching the wound with proclamations and reforms. But no decree could unspill the blood at Adrianople. The loss did not bring about the end, but it signaled the beginning of a new kind of vulnerability, one that would deepen with every new uprising, every new migration, every new failure to adapt. Rome, once the unstoppable force, had learned it could bleed. By the time the year 410 arrived, Rome was no longer the seat of emperors. The Western imperial court had long since moved north, first to Milan, then to Ravenna, a city surrounded by marshes and easier to defend. But the symbolism of Rome still lingered. It wasn't just a city, it was a memory made of stone, a relic of greatness. To the people who lived within its walls, it still felt eternal. Even if the statues were crumbling and the aqueducts cracked, it was still Rome, and that meant it couldn't fall. Alaric had other ideas. A Visigothic leader who had once fought for the empire, Alaric knew Rome from the inside. He had marched under Roman banners, held Roman titles, spoken in Latin to generals and governors. But he had also been passed over. His promises had been broken, his soldiers underpaid, his loyalty taken for granted. He was not an outsider in the traditional sense. He was a former ally, a former servant, now tired of waiting for recognition. His demands were not unreasonable at first. He asked for land for his people, for official status, for a place within the Roman world. He wanted the empire to keep the bargains it had made. But time and again the court at Ravenna refused. They negotiated, then reneged. They offered payment, then sent too little. Alaric, like many before him, learned that Roman diplomacy could be slippery, and finally he lost patience. He marched on Rome. It wasn't the first time a foreign army had approached the city's walls, but it had been centuries since anyone had breached them. The city was vast, circled by high fortifications and watchtowers, but its defenders were few. The legions were scattered elsewhere, chasing other threats. The gates were heavy, but not impenetrable, and perhaps more importantly, the will to resist had eroded. Rome's citizens, used to the idea of safety, now found themselves surrounded. Food supplies dwindled. Panic set in. Famine swept through the poorer districts. Some accounts speak of parents selling their children, of dogs being eaten, of plague rising in the filth. The Senate tried to negotiate, but could offer little. The Emperor Honorius, safe in Ravenna, refused to budge. He sent no help. He made no promises. Rome, the city of emperors, was now politically abandoned. On the night of August 24th, 410 AD, one of the city's gates opened. No one knows exactly how. Some say slaves betrayed their masters. Others say a deal was struck. But the result was the same. The Visigoths entered Rome. The sack lasted 3 days. There was looting, but not as much as might be imagined. Alaric had instructed his men not to burn churches, not to harm those seeking refuge inside them, but theft, violence, and humiliation were unavoidable. Temples were stripped of their ornaments, statues were toppled, nobles were dragged from their homes, gold was taken, silk, spices, manuscripts, even door hinges. If it had value, it was carried away. Women were violated, homes were desecrated, sacred places were trampled, but it wasn't total destruction. It wasn't Carthage or Jerusalem. Rome wasn't razed to the ground. It was wounded, and that wound was psychological. The shock rippled outward like a stone dropped in still water. The last time Rome had been taken by force was nearly 800 years earlier. It had withstood civil wars, foreign incursions, and plagues. It had always been spared. That it could be entered, defiled, and emptied by outsiders. It felt like the end of the world. In distant provinces, people wept. Christian theologians scrambled to explain how this could happen. Pagan philosophers claimed it was divine punishment for abandoning the old gods. Saint Jerome, living in Bethlehem, wrote in anguish, "If Rome can perish, what can be safe?" And yet, Rome didn't die. The city still stood. The people still lived. After 3 days, Alaric left, taking his spoils and his army and marching south. He died not long after, buried, if the legends are true, beneath the diverted riverbed, with treasure he would not live to spend. His dream of a Gothic kingdom within Roman borders never came to pass. But the mark he left was permanent, because after 410, the illusion was gone. Rome had been touched, entered, brought low. It was no longer untouchable, no longer eternal. It was a city like any other, vulnerable, political, human. People began to adjust their thinking. Power was no longer tied to the city. It had shifted elsewhere, to Ravenna, to Carthage, to Constantinople. Rome was still revered, but from a distance. The emperors rarely returned. The Senate became a ceremonial body. The population continued to shrink. In time, new sacks would follow. More armies would pass through its gates. The Vandals would arrive decades later. But the first time always leaves the deepest scar. The sack of 410 was not just a military act. It was the sound of a world beginning to realize it was no longer what it used to be. And like so much of the fall, it happened not with fanfare, but with a quiet dread. A dread that spread through the streets like mist settling into the stones. Rome was still there, but it no longer felt safe to believe in it. Rome had survived its first sack, barely. In the decades that followed, the city tried to recover, but recovery was not what it used to be. The resources weren't there, the will was frayed, and worse, the empire itself was pulling apart at the seams. After Alaric's departure, the Western Roman Empire entered a kind of dazed survival mode. The government in Ravenna clung to ceremony, issued decrees, and appointed figurehead emperors. But its control over the provinces was collapsing, one region at a time. It wasn't just that enemies were attacking, it was that allies were becoming independent. The empire had once been an interconnected system. Now it was a patchwork, and some of those patches were starting to sew themselves into something new. In North Africa, a region that had once been the breadbasket of the empire, a group called the Vandals was settling in. They were another so-called barbarian group, Germanic in origin, but by this point a mix of many peoples. They had migrated through Gaul and Hispania, clashing with Roman troops, forming treaties, breaking them, and moving on. By 429 AD, they had crossed into Africa. Their leader, Genseric, was cautious, clever, and deeply ambitious. He saw opportunity not just in looting the empire, but in replacing it. The Romans, distracted by internal chaos and the loss of other territories, underestimated the Vandals' potential. What was meant to be a brief campaign or nuisance turned into something permanent. Within a decade, Genseric had seized Carthage, one of the most important cities in the Western Empire. With it came power, food supplies, and control of the Mediterranean shipping lanes. Suddenly, the Vandals weren't just a wandering tribe, they were a naval force. From their new base, they launched raids across the Mediterranean. They struck islands, ports, and coastal towns. They disrupted the flow of goods and grain. Rome, already weakened, began to feel the pinch. Ships stopped arriving. The markets grew emptier. Diplomacy with the Vandals failed repeatedly. Genseric had no reason to deal with a crumbling power when he could dictate terms himself. Then, in 455 AD, the Vandals came for Rome. This time, the political situation was even more precarious than in Alaric's day. The Western Emperor, Petronius Maximus, had only recently seized power after a palace coup. His legitimacy was thin, his support even thinner. When word reached the city that the Vandals were approaching, the emperor tried to flee. A mob caught him in the street. He was killed, his body mutilated and thrown into the river. There would be no heroic last stand. Pope Leo I, the same man who would later negotiate with Attila the Hun, went out to meet Genseric. According to tradition, he begged the Vandal king to spare the city from destruction. Genseric agreed, more or less. There would be no slaughter, no fires, no raising of monuments, but there would be a sack. The Vandals entered Rome without resistance. What followed was methodical. The sack lasted for 2 weeks, longer than Alaric's and more complete. Anything that could be carried away was taken: gold, silver, bronze, article religious artifacts, decorative stone, jewels pried from statues, furniture, even the copper roofing was stripped from buildings and loaded onto ships. The temples were emptied. The imperial palace was looted. Noble families were stripped of their wealth. Some were taken hostage, including the empress and her daughters. Many captives were ransomed. Others vanished into the Vandal kingdom. Despite the promise not to burn the city, the damage was deep. Doors were smashed, statues broken, bones disturbed. Rome wasn't leveled, but it was gutted. This second sack left a mark not just on the buildings, but on the psyche of the people. The first time could be seen as an exception, a breach in the order, but the second, only 45 years later, felt like confirmation. The empire couldn't protect its heart. The illusion of control had become impossible to sustain, and this time there would be no recovery. North Africa, now firmly in Vandal hands, was lost for good. The grain shipments that once fed the Roman population never resumed. Trade across the Western Mediterranean dwindled to a trickle. The Western Empire, once dependent on the wealth of its provinces, was now a hollow core with nothing flowing in. In the years that followed, Rome shrank further. Its population declined, Its forums grew overgrown, its fountains dried up. Senators still gathered in marble halls, but they debated meaningless motions. Emperors came and went, often installed by generals, sometimes mere teenagers, rarely respected. But the Vandals thrived for a time. Carthage became a rival to what was left of Rome. Their ships controlled sea lanes. Their leaders minted coins and signed treaties. They were not just destroyers, they were successors, at least in their own eyes. Still, they would not last forever. But their sack of Rome remained one of the most symbolic events of the empire's final century. So much so that the word vandalism would be born from it, unfairly perhaps, but telling. The image of outsiders entering the city, taking what they wanted, and sailing away while the eternal city watched, powerless. After the Vandals left, Rome was never quite the same, not because the buildings were gone, but because the belief that Rome was safe had been destroyed. From the outside, the Roman Empire still appeared to be a single entity. Its name evoked unity, its traditions linked across generations, its eagles stamped into coins and carved into stone. But by the 5th century, the division between East and West was more than a practical arrangement. It had become a split in everything, from wealth and language to stability and survival. The Roman world had fractured along a seam that no longer could be stitched back together, and it was becoming increasingly clear which side would endure. In the eastern half of the empire, centered around Constantinople, the machinery of state continued to function. The roads were still patrolled, the granaries were still stocked. The imperial bureaucracy, so often mocked for its complexity, remained intact, issuing taxes, appointing governors, enforcing law. The city of Constantinople itself, built by Constantine the Great over the bones of Byzantium, was flourishing. Surrounded by mighty walls and protected by its geography, it had become a fortress of civilization. Trade passed through its harbors. Art and learning were preserved in its halls. Its court was sophisticated, sometimes ruthless, but unmistakably Roman in structure. Meanwhile, the western half of the empire was falling into silence. Rome, as a city, was declining. Ravenna, its political substitute, was isolated in the marshes, harder to attack but easier to ignore. Western provinces like Gaul, Hispania, and Britannia were fragmenting. Local warlords held real power. Cities shrank or were abandoned. Roads became unsafe. The central government could no longer enforce laws, collect taxes, or supply armies with consistency. One by one, imperial provinces slipped away, not in dramatic declarations of independence, but in the quiet, steady way that forgotten things fade. Part of the difference was geography. The East had natural borders, mountains, seas, narrow straits that helped shield it from invasions. Its cities were closer together, its population more concentrated. Egypt, Asia Minor, Syria. These were wealthy, fertile lands that fed and funded the eastern state. The West, by contrast, was exposed. Its provinces spread wide. Its frontiers were under constant pressure from migrating tribes, rebellious generals, and internal unrest. But it wasn't just geography that made the difference. It was mindset. The Eastern Empire adapted. It absorbed shocks, compromised when needed, bribed when necessary, and shifted its policies to survive. Emperors in the East were often more experienced, more pragmatic, sometimes more cynical. They relied on diplomacy as much as military strength, and they took the long view: defend the capital, protect the food supply, preserve the structure. In the West, politics remained chaotic, emperors were still declared by military force. Few ruled for long. Some were children, others were puppets. Behind them stood generals or court officials who truly held power. But even they were often replaced, exiled, or executed before they could stabilize anything. The West didn't just lose land, it lost continuity. At times, the East tried to help. Reinforcements were sent, aid was offered, but Constantinople also had its own problems to manage, and there was always a calculation behind the aid. Would helping the West drain the East? Was the cause already lost? Eventually, the East began to see the Western Empire not as a brother to be rescued, but as a corpse to be scavenged, a shell of something once great, now too far gone. This divergence can be seen in something as simple as the law. In the East, Roman law continued to evolve, culminating centuries later in the famous codification under Emperor Justinian. The legal traditions of Rome were preserved, clarified, and systematized. In the West, law became local, tribal customs mixed with old Roman statutes. In some places, law was whatever the strongest warlord declared it to be. The uniformity that once defined the empire began to dissolve. Religion, too, took on different tones. Christianity had become the dominant faith in both East and West, but disputes over doctrine, language, and leadership widened the gap. In Constantinople, the church was closely tied to the state, with emperors playing a direct role in shaping theology. In the West, where the imperial government was weakening, the church began to step into the vacuum. Bishops gained authority. Popes began to speak with voices louder than emperors. The church didn't just minister to the people, it governed them. For ordinary citizens, the distinction between East and West wasn't always clear. Life was local. A farmer in southern Gaul might not know or care who sat on the throne in Ravenna or Constantinople. What mattered was whether the harvest came, whether the roads were safe, whether taxes were payable. But over time, even these basics began to feel different depending on where you lived. In the East, you might still use imperial coin, hear news from distant provinces, and serve in a structured army. In the West, you were more likely to barter, gossip at market stalls, and follow the orders of whichever local strongman controlled the area. By the end of the 5th century, it was clear that there was no going back. The Western Roman Empire was a ghost, still wearing the robes of state, still speaking the language of power, but with no pulse beneath. The Eastern Roman Empire, meanwhile, would continue for another 1,000 years. Historians would come to call it the Byzantine Empire, but its citizens still called themselves Romans. They spoke Greek instead of Latin. They prayed in churches adorned with gold mosaics. They fought wars on different frontiers, but in their hearts, they believed they carried forward the flame of something eternal. The West had crumbled, but in the East, the torch was still lit. For centuries, the Roman military had been the pride of the empire, a machine of precision, discipline, and fearsome reputation. It built the empire as much as any senate or emperor ever had. It was the military that paved the roads, guarded the frontiers, and ensured that Roman law meant something more than just words on a scroll. Legionaries were trained, uniformed, and bound by strict codes. The chain of command was firm. The punishments were harsh, and the results were legendary. From the deserts of Egypt to the misty forests of Britannia, Roman soldiers marched and conquered in near unison. But by the late empire, the machine had begun to break. The first signs were subtle. Reports from the provinces mentioning missing patrols, fortresses under-maintained, or outposts failing to report at all. Recruitment numbers began to dip. Soldiers began to desert. New recruits lacked training, but more importantly, they lacked loyalty, not necessarily to the empire, but to the idea of it. In earlier centuries, to be a Roman soldier was to serve something enormous, something eternal. Now, the empire no longer inspired awe. It inspired confusion, exhaustion, or worse, indifference. Part of the decline was financial. The empire's economy had grown weaker, and military wages reflected that. Soldiers were once paid well enough to send money home, to save, to build a small life after their service. But debased coinage and inflation eroded that incentive. Delays in payment became frequent. Entire campaigns were carried out by men who hadn't seen a denarius in months. Supplies were mismanaged. Food shortages in military camps became common. Without proper gear or morale, discipline unraveled. And when the empire couldn't recruit enough from within its borders, it turned outward. More and more soldiers were drawn from Germanic tribes and other barbarian groups. These men were fierce fighters, and many served with honor. Some rose to high rank. But the structure was different now. Federated troops often served under their own leaders with their own customs. Integration was inconsistent. Loyalty was contractual, not cultural. A Gothic chieftain might fight for Rome today and raid a Roman province tomorrow, depending on whether promises were kept. This created a military less united, less disciplined, and more fragmented in purpose. Commanders bickered, generals shifted allegiances, civil wars between rival Roman factions became more common than wars with foreign enemies. Armies that once guarded the empire now turned on each other, backing different emperors, looting cities, and destroying infrastructure in pursuit of temporary advantage. Veteran legions were stretched thin. In some cases, garrisons simply left their posts, either recalled elsewhere or choosing not to die for a cause that no longer rewarded them. Remote provinces were abandoned. In Britain, Roman troops withdrew entirely, leaving towns and roads to fend for themselves. The locals, once dependent on Roman protection, were forced to hire their own militias or negotiate directly with invading tribes. The empire attempted reforms. Emperors tried reorganizing the military structure, creating mobile units meant to respond to threats more quickly. They built new fortifications along the frontiers, but these were desperate solutions. Rome was playing defense in too many places with too few resources. Even the famed Roman roads, once the arteries of conquest, began to fall into disrepair. Without secure transport and communication, regional commanders became more isolated, and coordination across the empire frayed further. The quality of leadership declined too. Gone were the great strategists and disciplined generals of the earlier empire. In their place came opportunists, palace favorites, or regional strongmen with limited experience. Political appointments outweighed military merit. Some were little more than figureheads. Others were brutal but short-sighted, more focused on immediate control than long-term stability. And then there was fear. As military failures mounted, emperors grew more paranoid. Some executed their own commanders on suspicion of betrayal. Others shuffled generals so frequently that no one could establish lasting control over a region. loyalty became a liability. Too loyal, a general might be seen as a threat. Too successful a soldier might be declared a usurper. Trust between emperor and army corroded. Officers no longer knew whether their victories would be rewarded or punished. The consequences reached into the villages and cities of the empire. Raids increased. Walls were no longer defended. Farmers began abandoning frontier lands, retreating to areas they believed safer, even if it meant poverty. Trade routes that had once been guarded by legionnaires now fell to bandits. Merchant caravans dwindled, and as these lifelines broke, so too did the empire's ability to supply and move its armies. In many cases, the people no longer saw the army as their protectors. In some regions, they feared Roman troops just as much as foreign raiders. When soldiers arrived, they often took what they needed, food, lodging, coin, without payment or permission. Civilians suffered under the weight of both sides, and once trust is broken between a people and their defenders, the whole idea of the state begins to feel hollow. The Roman military had once been a symbol of unity, of shared purpose, discipline, and imperial strength, but by the end it had become a collection of fragments, still dangerous, still present, but no longer cohesive, no longer Roman in the way it once was. It hadn't collapsed completely, not yet, but the edges were fraying, and the heart no longer beat in rhythm. By the final century of the Western Roman Empire, the title of emperor had lost much of its meaning. Once a symbol of unmatched authority, the emperor had been the axis around which the Roman world turned. Emperors had commanded armies, enacted laws, decided the fate of provinces. They were, in their prime, almost godlike figures, divinely sanctioned, distant, untouchable. But over time, as the empire's systems weakened and the real sources of power shifted, the throne became more ceremonial than sovereign, and those who sat on it increasingly found themselves forgotten. One of the reasons for this decline was the sheer number of emperors. In earlier times, a single emperor might rule for decades, leaving a legacy of reforms, conquests, or construction projects. But as the empire fractured, the frequency of succession exploded. Emperors came and went with alarming speed, many reigning for only a few months or years before being overthrown, assassinated, exiled, or quietly removed. The reasons varied: military defeat, court intrigue, betrayal, or simply falling out of favor with whoever truly held the reins. Many of these emperors were little more than figureheads, installed by powerful generals or bureaucrats who preferred a compliant mouthpiece on the throne. Others were children, chosen for their lack of political ambition. Some were declared emperor by their troops in the provinces, in direct opposition to whoever ruled from Ravenna or Constantinople. The empire became a chessboard with too many players, too many kings, and not enough rules. And behind each new emperor there was often a shadow, a commander, a court official, a foreign power, manipulating events for their own ends. Few of these emperors left behind great monuments or memorable speeches. Their names have largely vanished from common knowledge, overshadowed by the famous titans of Rome's earlier days. But their stories still tell us something about the state of the empire at the time. Men like Petronius Maximus, who ruled for just 75 days before being killed by a mob while trying to flee the Vandal invasion, or Avitus, declared emperor by a Gothic army, then overthrown and forced to become a bishop, or Anthemius, brought in from the Eastern Empire in a last-ditch attempt to stabilize the West, only to be murdered by his own son-in-law. Perhaps the most symbolic of these final emperors was Romulus Augustulus. His name echoed the beginning of Rome's story, Romulus, the legendary founder, and Augustus, the first true emperor. But Romulus Augustulus was no founder. He was a teenager, placed on the throne by his father, a general named Orestes, during a time of utter collapse. He ruled for just under a year before being forced to abdicate in 476 AD. His deposer, Odoacer, didn't even bother killing him. Instead, he sent the boy away to live in comfort, possibly in a seaside villa with a modest pension. Rome had no need for martyrs anymore, just silence. The fact that Romulus Augustulus is often considered the last Western Roman emperor is both fitting and misleading. Fitting because his deposition marked a point historians can circle on the calendar. Misleading because the empire had already stopped functioning long before. By the time Romulus was removed, much of the West had fallen into independent kingdoms. Italy itself was under the control of barbarian generals. The imperial title meant so little that Odoacer didn't even replace him with a new emperor. He simply sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople and declared that the West no longer needed its own ruler. And so the line ended, not with a grand final battle, but with paperwork and quiet resignation. For the people living through these years, the emperors became distant and interchangeable. A new name might be announced, a new face stamped onto coins, but daily life continued the same. Crops had to be planted, roads had to be repaired, children had to be fed. Whether the man in charge wore purple or not made little difference. The pageantry remained for a while. Imperial ceremonies, senate meetings, official decrees, but it all felt thinner, more like echoes than voices. The real power lay elsewhere, in the hands of warlords, bishops, landowners, and barbarian leaders who now styled themselves kings. They no longer needed Rome's permission. They carved out their own territories, minted their own coins, and enforced their own laws. And yet the throne still mattered in a symbolic way. Even as its political relevance faded, its myth remained. To be called emperor still meant something. It still conferred legitimacy, a sense of connection to a past that seemed greater than the present. That's why the Eastern Roman Empire continued to use the title for centuries, even as the West withered. That's why new rulers in the West, Franks, Goths, even Charlemagne centuries later, sought to revive it. The throne had become more ghost than government, but even ghosts have power. Looking back, these final emperors may seem tragic or laughable. Powerless boys, scheming generals, forgotten placeholders. But their rise and fall marked the final disintegration of what had once been the world's most formidable state. Each forgotten name was another crack in the marble, another loose thread in the imperial tapestry, until finally there was nothing left to sit on, just the memory of what it used to mean. History often focuses on the generals, the emperors, the sweeping battles and broken treaties. But while the empire rose and crumbled around them, most people simply lived. They tilled the land, baked their bread, patched their roofs, and prayed for mild weather. And in the later years of the Western Roman Empire, the experience of daily life was not one of sudden collapse, but of slow unraveling. For the average Roman subject, whether they lived in a coastal town in Gaul, a crumbling village in northern Italy, or a dusty hillside farm in Hispania, the fall of Rome did not come as a loud crash. It came as a quiet fade. The signs were everywhere, but none of them seemed apocalyptic on their own. Roads became harder to travel, not all at once, but in stretches. First a pothole that was never fixed, then a bridge that collapsed and was simply avoided, then the disappearance of patrols that once kept the route safe. What used to be a 3-day trip to the next town became 4, then 5, until eventually no one went at all. News, once carried by messengers or official couriers, now arrived as rumor. Weeks late, garbled by distance and fear, markets, once lively centers of exchange, began to feel thinner. There were fewer stalls, fewer foreign goods, more empty baskets. Coins became strange, lighter, less trusted, sometimes refused entirely. In many places people returned to barter, a bag of grain for a bolt of cloth, a set of shoes in exchange for help with the harvest. Coinage still existed, but its role had shifted. It was less a tool of exchange and more a token of memory, something from better times. Food remained central as it always had. For many, survival was seasonal. A good harvest meant warmth and security. A bad one meant hunger. Droughts could linger. Rain might come too late. Granaries that once held surplus grain were empty or had been seized by local powers. Taxes were often collected in kind, wheat, oil, pigs, rather than coin, and when officials came to collect, they rarely arrived gently. In some places, farmers hid their best livestock or buried their stored grain to avoid losing everything. In others, they fled entirely, vanishing into the countryside or seeking shelter with landowners who promised protection in exchange for labor and obedience. Homes were simpler now. The grand villas of earlier centuries were being abandoned, their mosaics cracked, their baths dry. In their place rose smaller, sturdier homes, one-room cottages with thick walls and small windows. They were easier to heat, easier to defend, easier to forget. People built with what they had, not with what they remembered. Tile roofs were replaced with thatch. Marble columns were repurposed as fences. Statues became building stones. A past carved in stone was now chopped down for firewood. Religion had become a central part of daily life, not just for the soul, but for structure. The Christian Church, especially in the West, filled in the spaces where imperial administration had failed. Bishops became civic leaders. Churches became granaries, courts, and sanctuaries. The rhythms of life now followed the church calendar, not the emperor's decree. Prayers were offered not for glory, but for survival. Saints replaced heroes. Relics replaced imperial edicts. And for many, the church offered the only reliable source of charity, education, and continuity. Violence was sporadic. Some towns were raided, others left untouched. Bandits roamed more freely, but not everywhere. Some regions experienced long stretches of peace, punctuated by sudden terror. A raid might come without warning, doors broken, livestock stolen, buildings burned. Then the attackers would vanish into the woods, and life would resume, scarred but not stopped. People learned to live with uncertainty, to prepare for loss, to hold hope lightly. Education, once a mark of Roman identity, became rare. Schools closed, teachers left or found new work. Children learned trades, not letters. Latin was still spoken, but began to splinter into local dialects. The ability to read or write became special, even strange. Scrolls crumbled in forgotten libraries. Knowledge that had once passed freely across provinces now settled into isolated pockets, guarded by monks or hidden in private collections. But even in decline, life continued. Children were born, couples married, songs were sung, bread was baked. There were festivals, celebrations, moments of joy. People laughed, they danced, they mourned. In the face of loss, there was resilience. In the shadow of an empire's slow death, there was still life. And for most, there was no announcement that the empire had ended. No one stood in the town square to declare that Rome was gone, because in many ways it wasn't. The buildings were still there, the laws were still spoken aloud, the names still lingered in documents and memories, but they had lost their anchor. Rome had once been the center. Now it was just one more story told at night. To live in a dying empire is not to witness an explosion, but to feel the air grow thinner, to notice the candles burn lower, to wake up one morning and realize that what once held the world together now feels like something distant, like a dream you can't quite remember, or a song that fades before its final note. Cities had once been the crown jewels of the Roman world, hubs of trade, learning, administration, and culture. They were where laws were written, where markets flourished, where temples reached toward the sky. Rome itself, at its height, had teemed with more than 1 million souls. But by the twilight of the Western Empire, the rhythm of city life had begun to slow, then stagger, then stop. The lights were not snuffed all at once. They dimmed, flickered, and went out at different times, across different places, for different reasons. But the direction was unmistakable, away from the city and back to the land. At first it was subtle. A workshop closed because its supplier could no longer deliver materials. A bakery served fewer customers because grain shipments were delayed or intercepted. A public bathhouse fell into disrepair, the staff unpaid, the plumbing cold. One stall at the market stopped showing up, then another. The people didn't panic, they adjusted, they bought less, they bartered more, they stayed home. And as the sounds of the forum grew quieter, the city itself began to change. Infrastructure decayed. Without steady maintenance, aqueducts cracked and leaked, fountains dried up. Streets, once swept and patrolled, became rough and littered with debris. Roof tiles fell and weren't replaced. Statues toppled and lay where they fell. Some buildings were scavenged for materials, their marble reused for new, smaller structures, or burned for lime. Others were simply abandoned. Entire districts emptied, block by block, leaving shells of houses and hollow echoes. The people who remained behind were different too. The wealthy moved to the countryside, to villas that could support their needs independently. City elites, who once held court in grand atriums, now ruled over isolated estates where they could grow their own food, guard their own walls, and enforce their own authority. Without their presence, the urban centers lost both funding and direction. The poor stayed behind, not out of loyalty, but out of necessity. But even they began to drift, pulled toward places where the fields still yielded harvests, where protection was more immediate, and where daily life could be lived without the shadow of a dying city looming overhead. For some, the move to the countryside was a return to something older. Before Rome built its cities, it was a land of farmers, small homes, close to the earth, tied to the seasons. Now those rhythms returned. People planted vegetables instead of importing them. They raised chickens and goats Instead of purchasing meat from market stalls, families who had once lived in multi-story apartments now took shelter in stone cottages with thatched roofs and earthen floors. Life grew simpler, but also harder and more isolated. Religious life followed the shift. Urban churches remained, but the real growth came in rural chapels and monastic communities. Monks tilled the land and copied manuscripts. Villagers gathered in modest sanctuaries, seeking comfort in ritual and the promise of something beyond decay. The countryside became the new center, not of empire, but of survival, and in these smaller orbits, people found new forms of order. Some of the old Roman cities disappeared entirely. Their names lived on in documents, but their streets were swallowed by weeds. Others shrank into villages, their grand buildings turned into shelters, barns, or forgotten ruins. A city that once held 30,000 people might now hold 500. A forum might become a pasture. A basilica might house grain. The stone remained, but its purpose had shifted. And yet, this transformation wasn't always mournful. For many, it was simply life adapting to new conditions. The countryside was not a place of defeat. It was a place where food still grew, where communities could defend themselves, where life could go on without relying on distant and unreliable powers. In some ways, it was safer. There were no riots, no tax collectors knocking at the gate, no soldiers demanding supplies. There was labor, yes, and uncertainty, but also autonomy. Over time, the structure of society changed to reflect this rural turn. Large landowners became the new authorities, offering protection in exchange for service. These estates were not yet the full feudal manners of the medieval period, but the roots were growing. Dependence on imperial bureaucracy gave way to personal loyalty. The empire had ruled through laws and legions. The countryside ruled through promises and presents. Even art and architecture adapted. The ornate mosaics and marble facades of city buildings gave way to wooden beams and carved stone. Decorations were simpler, symbols more overt. Utility replaced grandeur. What mattered now was not impressing visitors, but enduring winters. Still, memories of the cities lingered. Children were told stories of wide avenues, of markets filled with spices and music, of festivals that lit up the night. Travelers passed crumbling walls and whispered of what once stood there. In some cases, the ruins became sacred, places of pilgrimage or superstition. People believed that something holy or terrible had happened there, and they approached with reverence. The empire had been a network of cities, connected by roads, bound by law, but in its final century, those threads were cut one by one, and what was left was not a single collapse, but a retreat, a stepping back from the heights of urban life into something smaller, rougher, but still enduring. Rome did not vanish in fire. It exhaled, slowly, until only whispers remained. In the beginning, Christianity had existed at the edges of empire. It was born in occupied provinces, whispered in secret, preached by outcasts and visionaries. Its followers met in hidden rooms, its leaders imprisoned, its beliefs mocked or feared by Roman elites. For centuries, it had been the religion of the powerless, enduring persecution, scattering in the face of imperial authority, persisting through faith rather than force. But as the Roman world began to unravel, the church moved inward. It filled the cracks, and as emperors faltered and institutions failed, the church began to rise, not as a replacement for empire, but as its quiet inheritor. The transformation didn't happen overnight. In the early 4th century, the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity, or at least aligned himself with it. He saw its potential not just as a spiritual force, but as a unifying one. Under his rule, Christianity moved from a fringe movement to a legally recognized religion. By the end of the century, it had become the official faith of the Roman state. Temples to the old gods were closed. Pagan rituals were banned. Churches were built, not in hiding, but in public squares, on hills, in the hearts of cities. But this alliance between church and empire was never simple. The church inherited not only favor, but responsibility. It had to navigate politics, power, and patronage. Bishops became administrators. Councils were held to settle disputes over doctrine. Heresies were named. Schisms formed. The simple gatherings of the early Christians gave way to elaborate ceremonies, theological debates, and a growing hierarchy of authority. Some welcomed the change. Others mourned the loss of purity. Still, as the empire weakened, especially in the West, the church remained. When governors fled and garrisons crumbled, the local bishops stayed. When taxes stopped flowing and roads fell apart, it was the church that tried to maintain some sense of structure. In many towns, the bishop became the most important figure, more influential than the magistrate, more respected than the remnants of imperial officials. The church offered not just prayers, but food, not just sermons, but arbitration. People brought their disputes to bishops instead of courts. They sought shelter in churches during invasions. They turned to priests for comfort and guidance when the world felt like it was ending. The physical structures of the church reflected this growing role. Basilicas, once public buildings of law and business, became places of worship. Stone churches replaced wooden chapels. Bells rang to mark the hours. Altars were dressed with silk. Saints' relics were placed beneath them. Walls were painted with scenes, not of imperial conquest, but of martyrdom and resurrection. The symbols of power changed. The eagle gave way to the cross. And in this shifting world, the church did more than survive. It adapted, it absorbed, it learned to negotiate with Gothic kings, with Vandal rulers, with Frankish chieftains. Many of these new powers were Christian themselves, though not always in the same way. The church had to navigate theological divides, especially between Roman Catholic and Arian Christian beliefs, but it did so carefully, often preserving its influence even as political control slipped away. Rome, the city, remained a spiritual center. Its bishop, eventually called the Pope, became a figure of growing importance, not because he commanded armies, but because he claimed the lineage stretching back to Saint Peter himself. In a world of vanishing emperors, that kind of continuity mattered, and so the papacy, once just one of several important Christian seats, began to rise above the others. It wasn't yet the dominant force it would become in the Middle Ages, but the roots had taken hold. Monasticism also flourished during this time. Men and women seeking a purer life retreated from cities and villages to live in solitude or in small communities. They farmed, prayed, and wrote. Some copied ancient texts, preserving not only the Bible, but also fragments of Roman law, Greek philosophy, and early science. In the scriptoriums of these early monasteries, much of the ancient world's wisdom was quietly saved, one page at a time. The church also offered a different kind of promise, one not tied to empire or geography. It preached a kingdom not of this world, a hope beyond borders and politics. For people living through the slow decay of Roman authority, this message resonated deeply. The empire had promised eternity and failed. The church offered eternity of a different kind and kept speaking even as cities fell silent. That isn't to say the church was without fault. It struggled with corruption, internal conflict, and power struggles. It could be just as political as the emperors it outlived, but it endured, and in a time when so many pillars of Roman life were collapsing, endurance was everything. By the end of the 5th century, it was clear that the Roman Church had become something more than a religious institution. It was a cultural anchor, a political actor, a keeper of memory. It carried forward not just the faith, but the remnants of a civilization. Its hymns echoed in abandoned basilicas. Its priests walked roads that legions no longer guarded. Its candles flickered where law had gone dark. And so, as the empire faded, the church remained. Not a perfect successor, but a quiet one. A hand reaching through the dust, holding a torch that would burn through the long night ahead. The year 476 AD often appears in textbooks as the final moment, the official end of the Western Roman Empire, a clean date, a historical exhale. But as with most turning points, it wasn't marked by fireworks or declarations. There were no crowds shouting in the streets, no banners torn from walls, no imperial statues toppled by angry mobs. The end came, as so much had before it, in a quiet transaction of power, stripped of grandeur, devoid of ceremony, and understood by only a few as something final. At the center of this moment was Odoacer, a man who, like so many figures of the empire's last days, existed in a space between labels. He was a soldier, a general, a leader of men, but not Roman by blood. Born into a Germanic tribe, likely the Scyrians, Odoacer had served in the Roman army, climbed its ranks, and watched the state from within. He was not an invader in the traditional sense. He lived and moved inside the empire, spoke its language, understood its politics, and when the time came, he saw the opportunity to reshape its future. By the mid-470s, the Western Empire had become a hollow thing. The true authority rested not with emperors, but with generals and local strongmen. One such figure was Orestes, a Roman official of barbarian descent who had once served Attila the Hun. Orestes seized power in 475, installing his own teenage son, Romulus Augustulus, on the throne. It was a familiar pattern, the puppet emperor, the powerful father, behind the curtain. But Odoacer, commanding a large contingent of federated troops who had grown tired of being underpaid and underfed, refused to accept this arrangement. The troops demanded land in Italy, a reward long promised, often delayed. Orestes refused, so they turned to Odoacer. What followed was not a prolonged war, but a swift revolt. Orestes was captured and executed. Romulus, the boy emperor, was spared, perhaps out of pity, perhaps to avoid drawing attention. He was sent into quiet exile, likely to live on a seaside estate in Campania. No dungeon, no execution, no exile to a distant province, just the fading away of a title that no longer held weight. With Romulus gone, there was no rush to replace him. Odoacer did not crown himself emperor. Instead, he sent the imperial regalia, the crown, the purple robe, the scepter, to Constantinople, to Emperor Zeno, the ruler of the Eastern Roman Empire. The message was simple: There was no need for a separate Western emperor anymore. One Rome was enough. Zeno accepted a gesture, formally granting Odoacer the title of patrician and recognizing him as the de facto ruler of Italy. It was a polite fiction, but it served both sides. Odoacer had control, Zeno had the appearance of unity, and so the line of Western Roman emperors ended, not with a bang, but with a resignation. The throne was not overthrown, it was set aside. To the average citizen, little may have seemed to change. There was no new flag, no sweeping proclamation. The grain still needed to be harvested, the markets still opened at dawn, but the world had shifted. For the first time in centuries, the western provinces no longer had an emperor of their own. The symbol was gone, and symbols, while intangible, hold deep power. Odoacer ruled as king of Italy, not emperor. He maintained Roman institutions where they were useful. He worked with the Senate. He kept the peace. But the transformation was undeniable. Italy was no longer part of a Roman Empire in the old sense. It was a kingdom now, barbarian in origin, Roman in style, independent in practice. Historians later chose 476 as the end of the Western Empire because it offers closure, a final chapter, a name and a date to mark the passing of an age. But in truth, the empire had been dying for generations. Romulus Augustulus did not lose an empire, he inherited a shadow of one, and Odoacer did not destroy Rome, he simply stepped into the space where it had once stood. There is a certain poetry in the names. Romulus, the founder of Rome, and Romulus Augustulus, the last boy to sit on its western throne. The echo is almost too perfect, as though history folded in on itself, tying the end to the beginning. Augustulus, meaning little Augustus, suggests not grandeur, but diminishment, a child emperor for a fallen empire. And yet, despite the symbolic weight, the world did not end in 476. The Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire, continued for nearly 1,000 more years. The Church carried forward Roman customs, language and law. Many in Europe still called themselves Romans or heirs to Rome. Long after the city itself had fallen silent, the idea of Rome endured, transformed, reinterpreted, but never entirely lost. The fall of the Western Roman Empire wasn't a sudden collapse, it was a surrender to change, a release of old structures that no longer held, and at its final moment there were no enemies at the gate, no flaming chariots in the streets, just a young man stepping down and a soldier stepping up. The empire had fallen, or so it seemed. The Western Roman throne sat empty, the legions scattered, the laws left unenforced in many provinces, and yet Rome did not vanish. Like a fire that continues to smolder beneath ash, the Roman world persisted, in languages, in buildings, in customs, in the very shape of Europe itself. The body of the empire had broken, but its soul drifted onward, carried by those who had once bowed to it, now rising in its absence. The afterlife of Rome was not a ghost story, it was a slow and living transformation. Perhaps the most immediate torchbearer was the Eastern Roman Empire, what we now call the Byzantine Empire. It did not think of itself as something separate. Its rulers called themselves Roman emperors. Its people spoke of the Roman state. Though the dominant language had shifted to Greek and the court customs grew increasingly Eastern in style, the laws, titles, and mindset remained rooted in the imperial tradition. Constantinople's emperors saw themselves not as successors, but as continuations. They issued decrees under Roman codes, led armies under Roman banners, and defended what they considered the true heart of the empire. This eastern branch of Rome would survive for another 1,000 years, navigating invasions, plagues, civil wars, and theological disputes. It would reshape the Christian world, influence trade from the Mediterranean to the Silk Road, and serve as a beacon of art, architecture, and scholarship. Even as the West fell into what later generations would call the Dark Ages, the East continued to shine, its churches glittering with mosaics, its libraries swelling with scrolls, its ships sailing to distant shores. When people spoke of empire, they still meant Rome, even if the capital now stood at the edge of Europe. But the West was not without echoes of its own. The Catholic Church, increasingly centralized around the papacy in Rome, stepped into the space once held by the empire's civil authority. Bishops became regional governors in all but name. Monasteries preserved knowledge, copied texts, taught reading and writing, and passed along legal and medical traditions. The Church became the thread connecting the old world to the new, maintaining rituals that once mirrored imperial ceremonies, adapting Roman architecture for cathedrals, and keeping Latin alive in its prayers and proclamations. Even more striking was how the concept of Rome lingered in the minds of new rulers. The tribes that had once been called barbarians did not reject the Roman past. They sought to possess it. Kings of the Franks, Ostrogoths, and Visigoths styled themselves as Roman governors, consuls, or even emperors. They issued edicts in Latin, wore Roman-style regalia, and traced their legitimacy through imagined connections to the old empire. The most famous of these efforts came in the year 800 AD, when Charlemagne, king of the Franks, was crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III. This was not just a religious gesture, it was a deliberate resurrection of the imperial idea. The Holy Roman Empire, as it would come to be known, was neither holy nor Roman, nor truly an empire in the old sense. But the symbolism mattered. The memory of Rome still had power. It gave weight to crowns and sanctified borders. And so, for centuries to come, rulers across Europe would claim to be Roman emperors, even as they presided over lands the original Caesars had never known. Beyond institutions, the legacy of Rome lived on in the more ordinary rhythms of daily life. Latin, though it fractured and changed, remained the root of many languages: French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian. The calendar used to track the year, the laws governing property and inheritance, the shape of cities with their forums and straight roads. All of these were Roman in origin. People lived in houses built from Roman stone, walked beneath Roman aqueducts, and tilled land divided by Roman boundaries. They might not have called it empire anymore, but they lived in its outline. Roman engineering too left a long shadow. Bridges, roads, baths, and sewers, often in ruins, sometimes repaired, shaped how future generations built their own infrastructure. In some places, Roman roads remained the best paths for travel even centuries later. The techniques of Roman construction were studied, copied, and eventually revived. Architecture, especially during the Renaissance, looked back to Roman forms, arches, domes, columns, as ideals of beauty and balance. Even in art and literature, the Roman spirit endured. Writers like Virgil, Cicero, and Ovid continued to be copied, studied, and admired. Their words shaped the way later Europeans thought about politics, ethics, love, and power. Their characters and stories inspired new generations of poets and philosophers. The dream of Rome became a mirror in which later societies saw their own aspirations: order, strength, civilization. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of Rome's afterlife is how it remained a benchmark. When new states rose, they measured themselves against Rome. When cities were founded, they were called New Rome, Nova Roma, or later even Moscow, which would declare itself the Third Rome. The title of Caesar became Kaiser in Germany, Tsar in Russia. The empire had died, but its name continued to echo in the mouths of kings. In this way, Rome became more than a state. It became an idea, fluid, adaptable, resilient. It was not bound to its borders or even to its people. It became a cultural memory that could be inherited even by those who had once been its enemies. And so, while 476 marks a kind of ending, it is also the beginning of something else, not a rebirth, but a diffusion. Rome didn't vanish, it scattered. It seeded itself across a continent, took root in unexpected places, and bloomed in forms its founders never imagined. It was no longer an empire, but it was still everywhere. By now, the walls have quieted. The streets once filled with merchants and messengers have grown still. The aqueducts have run dry. The sun has set many times over the empire's long shadow. And in this hush, as we look back across centuries of ambition, brilliance, mistakes and slow decay, the story of Rome begins to soften at the edges. Not gone, not forgotten, but no longer marching forward. It has exhaled its last, and what remains is memory. The kind of memory you feel more than speak, the kind that lives in old stones and whispered prayers, in languages shaped by distant voices, in cities whose names carry echoes of marble and dust. Letting go of Rome was never easy, not for those who lived through its unraveling, nor for the generations who followed, each of them staring back at the ruins and wondering how such a world could have crumbled. For centuries, Rome had seemed invincible. Its laws reached across continents. Its roads stitched together the known world. Its coins bore the faces of gods and emperors, passed from hand to hand like promises. It had become, for those who belonged to it, more than a government. It was a rhythm, a scaffold for life, a constant. But constants fade. Empires, even the greatest of them, are mortal. They shift, they fracture, they vanish, first in the margins, then in the heart. The eternal city was never truly eternal. That was just what people whispered to themselves to keep fear away. And yet, perhaps there is something sacred in the slow ending, something beautiful in the way the world changes when no one is steering it anymore. Rome did not go out with the scream of collapsing temples or the trumpet of doom. It went quietly. It wore away like stone beneath water. It became soft in the middle, then thin at the edges, then too fragile to hold. But in that unraveling, it left behind the fabric of what would come next. All things that live must end. But Rome was not merely a thing. It was an idea so large that it couldn't fit in any single time or place. That's why it lingers, not in power, but in structure, not in conquest, but in culture. Every building designed with arches, every system of law grounded in rights and precedent, every tongue that grew from Latin's root, they all carry pieces of it. A mosaic, not a monument. Letting go, then, is not forgetting. It's remembering more gently. It's walking past the crumbling wall and seeing not ruin but foundation. It's reading the names of emperors and not needing to know all their deeds, but knowing they lived and ruled and then were gone, just as we all are in our own time. Somewhere a candle still burns beside a statue and no one remembers why. Somewhere a page copied in a monastery carries a Roman phrase translated into the medieval mind. Somewhere a child stares up at columns and asks if giants built them. Somewhere an old road curves through a valley and no one questions why the stones are still there, flat and level and true. Rome lives there, in the unnoticed, the inherited, the quiet. And as we drift toward the end of this long tale, it's worth remembering that history is never just a series of dates and deeds. It's a landscape of human experience, of meals eaten and letters sent, of roads walked and songs sung, of nights like this one, when someone may have stared at the flickering fire and wondered what the future held. They wouldn't have known that centuries later someone would still be speaking of their world softly into the dark. Maybe they felt something ending. Maybe they were already dreaming of what would begin. And maybe now, as your breath slows and your eyes grow heavier, you can feel that gentle ending too. Not a loss, not a grief, just a letting go. The way the tide pulls back, the way the sky darkens slowly, almost without notice, the way the stories we carry with us settle softly into sleep. Rome is quiet now, you can be too.